Shalom, welcome to another episode of Inspiration from Zion. I'm Jonathan Feldstein. I have the privilege of being your host, coming to you from the Judean Mountains here in Israel. I like to refer to it as the original Bible Belt. Inspiration from Zion is a program of the Genesis 123 Foundation, whose mission is to build bridges between Jews and Christians with Israel in ways that are new, unique, and meaningful. I pray that you will find this all of those. Through this program, we're excited to connect you to people and stories in and relating to Israel to give you a window to look through, experiencing aspects of life here that you might not otherwise know about. We want this to be interactive, so please be in touch at inspirationfromzion@gmail.com and send along any questions and any comments about any topic anytime. Or you can follow Inspiration from Zion at genesis123.co or follow on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Stay tuned until the end, where, as always, we have an exciting opportunity for you, and please feel free to share this with others who will also find it of interest. I don't think I, like many other people in the world, could have let the press conference and incredible remarks made by President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu this past week pass without any kind of remarks. And I thought about, okay, do we really need to do this? And I resolved the answer is yes. But this is not for me telling you what I think. Actually, if anyone's interested, I did post an article that's been published in a number of different places, what I do think, simply because so many people reached out asking what I thought, and I got tired of answering all the questions individually. So that's my public record on it. But today, I'm really excited, and I think we're going to go. I don't know which direction we're going to go, which is sort of like the press conference itself. Um, I'm very excited and very grateful to have three noted, incredible journalists who I won't do justice introducing, because if I were to do, we would be here all night with the introductions. So let me introduce, and then we're going to jump right in. This is also being broadcast live as a webinar, so you can catch it on YouTube afterward, and also will be on the Inspiration from Zion podcast network. First of all, in alphabetical order, Kalev Ben David has a 4-decade journalism career covering stories relating to Israel as an anchor of I-24 News program The Rundown, Israel bureau chief of Bloomberg News, managing editor of the Jerusalem Post, where he also worked as a reporter and editor for over 20 years, and he was also senior arts editor of the Jerusalem Report. He's lectured on journalism at the IDC's Ofer School of Communication and serves as a frequent commentator on Israeli affairs for numerous international media. Kalev was the founding director of the Jerusalem office of the Israel Project, what seems like a century ago, huh? And a nonprofit that worked to improve Israel's image in international media. And also, let's not forget that Kalev had a significant birthday yesterday. Happy birthday. It's really good to be able to wish you many, many good more years.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you.
Rolene Marks is a spokesperson for the South African Zionist Federation, a respected journalist and head of public diplomacy for World Wezo. She appears frequently on international radio and TV programs and is published around the world. She owns Rolene Marks Consulting, specializing in media, public relations, consulting on Jewish and Israeli-related issues, and media training with clients around the world, including public relation companies, nonprofit, security, strategic planning, high-tech, and commercial. She's also co-founder of Lay of the Land, which can be followed at layoftheland.online, and host of the Israel Brief on YouTube, and co-founder of the South Africa Israel Policy Forum. Chris Mitchell established the CBN News Middle East Bureau in August 2000. Since then, he's covered many major events in the region, including the Second Intifada, the Second Lebanon War, the Arab Spring in 2011, the rise of ISIS in 2014, the historic Abraham Accords, and just told the story of persecuted Christians in the Middle East. Chris also serves as executive director of Jerusalem Dateline, covering the Middle East, seen in many countries around the world, and broadcast on Daystar, God TV, and the NRB networks. He's also the author of Dateline Jerusalem, an eyewitness account of prophecies unfolding in the Middle East. Kalev, Rolene, and Chris, I am really thrilled and grateful to have you join us here today.
Thank you for having us.
Great to be with you.
So I have to be honest. I didn't know. I knew we were going to have this conversation. I didn't know until this morning which way it was going to begin. And as I was walking to services, I was in, involved in a little pre-worship prayer. And while I was sitting there and we actually got into the Torah reading from Exodus chapter 14 and 15, it really struck me that this probably is an appropriate place to go and to begin biblically. In today's Torah portion, we read about God splitting the sea and then covering the Egyptian army that pursues the Israelites who have just fled Egypt. And immediately in the first verse of chapter 15, we read about the Jewish people celebrating on the shore, for which we earned a bit of rebuke in later chapters. And I'm wondering, maybe just to start with an observation before we get into the details, how do you think that biblical analogy of celebrating the vanquishing of our enemies might be relevant to today's conversation about taking over Gaza, moving out the Gazans, and other things like that? In this case, I'll begin ladies first.
I think it's a difficult question to ask on a day like this, because in preparing for tonight's panel, it's very, very difficult not to be emotionally informed by the scenes that we saw coming out of Gaza today. I don't like to use Holocaust analogies, but the sight of our hostages being so emaciated and frail, and yet being paraded around like a trophy, like a prize, it's very, very difficult not to feel angry and vengeful at what we have seen. Today has been a particularly, probably the worst day for all of us emotionally, of hostage releases. And I was actually thinking of the Parshat HaShavua myself today, because we start to go through the Red Sea to have faith. And what you're saying now reminds me that even though we can't see it right now, we have to have faith that we're going to come out on the other side of this, and that hopefully, like our enemies through generations before us, this enemy will be vanquished as well. And I think that this is a good leading question to get into where we are going to go with this discussion about President Trump's very, very unpredictable bombshell of a proposal. I'm still trying to pick my jaw up off the floor. I wondered why I was getting so many Gaza logo emojis, and now I understand why. And while I'm trying to reconcile what I've seen today with trying to be as rational as possible and as humane as possible, I think today's panel is very, very timeless.
Good. Okay. Thank you. Timeless as the Torah. Chris, Kalev, you want to jump in on the biblical connection?
Well,
Is there?
I
Is it
just, you're
appropriate?
referencing, you made a brief reference, Jonathan, to the fact that in other Jewish sources, the Torah and also in other Jewish sources, but on the Bible, the Midrash, the Talmud, God actually reprimands the children of Israel for celebrating the death of presumably tens or hundreds of thousands of Egyptians between the shores of the Red Sea, saying you should temper your celebration with noting their tragedy, which of course it's a difficult thing, admittedly, given what Rolene said, the condition of what we saw of the returning hostages this morning, and the way the Gazans have made it into this show, difficult to temper our anger with any kind of feelings of compassion or mercy for enemies. But that is a reminder in the Torah to do that. But I'll just make one quick point. It was an incredible miracle, the parting of the Red Sea, the saving of the Jews from the slaughtered by the Egyptian troops and be delivered out from slavery. But that was the beginning of 40 hard years of wandering, where basically almost all of those people, except for Joshua and my namesake, Caleb ben Yefuneh, pass away in the desert and don't make it to the promised land. So we're going to be discussing the vision of Donald Trump. It's a vision. Actually making it to a kind of promised land of a solution in Gaza that it's going to be, it may not be 40 years, but it's
Okay.
certainly not going to be an easy trek.
No, that's actually a very good point. And Chris, I want to come to you, especially because of your background, and also not just looking at news, but news prophetically here. But if we continue at the very end of this week's Torah portion, we're saved at the shores of the Red Sea, and then the Amalekites attack us from behind. So it's not like it's total salvation now, is it?
No, not at all. And I think the biblical perspective is a great way to start. And as Rolene said, if you look at it historically and throughout the millennia, the Jews, the Israelites, the Israelis have had enemies throughout the generations. And however, God has spared them and will do so again, even with Hamas, even though it looks very bleak now. I would say that it's really quite a time to pray as well for Jews and Christians, for the rest of the hostages. And as Rolene said, this was probably the most difficult emotionally of all the hostage releases, the emaciated look of all of Ohad, Eli, and Or. And we were talking just before we started, Caleb mentioned it's probably not going to get better because we know that there are others who won't be coming home alive. And I think almost everybody is focused on the Bibas family, Shiri, Ariel, and Kiefer. So it's going to get hard, but I think in the midst, looking at it from a biblical and millennial perspective, God will still stand with his people and get through this. I would just jump off as well to Trump's statement. It sounds pretty, on the face of it, it sounds like, oh, we'll just have almost 2 million people leave and we'll just rebuild. And either they can come back or it'll be quite the Singapore of the Mediterranean, as people had hoped in 2005, when the 21 Jewish communities were taken away. But my feeling is that Hamas is not going to be easy to extract from Gaza. I think that's going to be hard. There's a saying, I guess, Sun Tzu in The Art of the War, the enemy has a vote. So they and right now, and their statements today make it quite clear that they plan to be the power in Gaza the day after.
Indeed, well said. So let's move to Trump's comments. I'm gonna and the three of you who are far more seasoned than I, feel free to interject and correct me if I'm wrong. But they're basically two, I think, concepts that were I don't know if floated is the right word or dropped from a C-130. More likely, but the two are the moving out of 2 million or so. It's unclear whether he meant all of the Gazans or 1.8 million, which is most of them, or whatever. But he's talking about the vast majority to be moved out, and it was not clear whether that was to be encouraged in some way or whether it would to be voluntary. And then the second comment which was not particularly received well in terms of the U.S. owning Gaza. By the way, just as an aside, I'm seeing a lot of memes on social media about the two-state plan that we can all agree to, which is U.S. controlling Gaza and Israel the rest, which strikes me as being inappropriate for those who have a hard time splitting the biblical land of Israel, because it shouldn't be U.S. control, it shouldn't be Gaza control, Hamas control, it should be Israel control. Not making a judgment on that. I'm just making an observation. But how realistic is Trump's plan to if we talk about first the migration on one end, it makes sense. You've got 2.3 or so million people there, and the place does need to be rebuilt. Chris, you've been in. I don't know, Caleb, if you have.
I have been in, and I served in Gaza as a soldier.
Not currently.
Not currently.
Okay.
Prior even to the Oslo Accords, I served in Gaza in 1989 in 1991. So that was even when Israel was full there. Look, before maybe we get to some of the concrete and some positive aspects of President Trump's pronouncement, in terms of the plan as he presented it, nothing's impossible in the Middle East, but the odds are greatly stacked in the way he specifically outlined it. Again, he now clarifies that the U.S. would only come in after Israel had basically, I guess, conquered all of Gaza and somehow eliminated Hamas. But of course, if Israel could have done that without sacrificing the hostages, it would have done that by now. I mean, that's how we reached where we are now. Certainly, if you told the Gazans you could immigrate to Israel, to Europe, you could immigrate to Canada, you could immigrate to the US, yeah, I think the majority of Gazans would leave. But to say to them you're going to go to Egypt or Jordan, countries which have trouble housing and feeding their own populations, I don't think that's a destination they'll want to go, and those countries are not going to willingly take them in either. That's another problem there. And then finally, as you said, and I'd be curious to hear Chris said that a lot of the pushback I've been seeing, for example, on social media, is from certain sector of supporters of President Trump who's saying, "What America? Why does America want Gaza? What do we need it for?" You know, even if it would be totally free of Hamas, even if it was totally free of Palestinians, it's still a piece of land in the Middle East. It sits right next to the Sinai Peninsula, which is a very problematic area, an area crawling with Islamist terrorists. And so I see a lot of supporters of President Trump, particularly saying that's maybe, you know, it's not Greenland. You know, why would America want to have that, even if it was a Riviera? So maybe Chris could address that, because that's the pushback I think that would probably most concern President Trump.
Yeah, I would think probably that, you know, people who don't want to get involved, more neo-isolationists, who don't want to, you know, get involved overseas, and particularly here in the Middle East. I would say that the way I've been thinking about it even today was I just recently read The Art of the Deal. And if you read that, you get a sense that he grew up as his dad was a developer in Queens, and then he went to Manhattan to make his mark, which is a much more difficult bite of an apple, to use that analogy. But he succeeded, and he really did quite well. So I think he thinks as a real estate developer. Steve Witkoff, who's been his Middle East envoy, apparently he went into Gaza and told Trump it's inhabitable. But they're both thinking like real estate developers. How can we make this, you know, a jewel of the Middle East? And I think that's part of their thinking. But as you said, there is quite daunting obstacles. Do the Gazans want to leave? I suspect many more want to leave than you would hear about publicly, only because of the backlash of Hamas and, you know, either threatening them with killing them or injuring them somehow. So and the countries that don't want to take them, Egypt says they don't want to take them. Jordan says, but if they could find a place where they could go, at least temporarily, I think more would go if they could. I just see that the main thing is that you've got to get rid of Hamas, and in the meantime, you've got to get the hostages. So those, to me, are the two major obstacles right now.
Yeah, and Hamas, as Kalev said, is not going anywhere. And of course, that's bad for Israel, but that's bad for the Gazans. Rolene, do you want to chime in on the realisticness of, you know, one question before you do, you can comment on, or someone else. Chris, you mentioned Art of the Deal, that this is somewhat, in a sense, classic Trump dropping a bombshell, literally, as a opening salvo in negotiation, and it was even something that is credited to one degree or another for the implementation of the Abraham Accords, talking about Israel making statements in his first term about Israel applying sovereignty to Judea and Samaria, and then the Emiratis suddenly say, "Oh, no, let's make peace." Maybe that's an oversimplification. Rolene, what do you think?
Well, I think there are many elements to this proposal. First of all, none of us have seen the practicalities. We've heard the announcement, but we haven't seen the minutiae, how he plans to, how he intends to carry this out. Now, if I was putting myself into the head of President Trump, which I'm sure is a very interesting place to be, and I'm thinking like a real estate development. For years, I've heard that Gaza can be the Singapore of the Middle East, and it's valuable real estate. It's coastal, it has a port which could be functional. The land should be, I don't know about how much it is now because of the war, should be very, very fertile land for farming, and it's not a very big strip of land. So, you know, ideally, it's easy to manage. And yes, this could be Trump, you know, putting out a very, very high-reaching goal to start negotiations somewhere. You know, the man didn't write the art of the deal for nothing. And my gut, when we started to hear about the terms of the first phase of this deal, was that I'm sure there's more to this than meets the eye. It's a horrific deal on the face of it, and I'm sure there's more to this than meets the eye. And
Rolene,
maybe we have to.
Rolene, I wanted to, we're using the term deal both in the context of his book and the hostage / ceasefire deal. I just want to clarify for people who are following that you're talking about the current hostage ceasefire deal. That's the horrible deal.
Yes, so that is the horrible deal I'm speaking about. And I have a feeling, this is my gut, that the Israeli side was told, listen, some short-term pain for some long-term gain. We're not going to tell you what it is, but we will bring something to the table that's going to shock you. And I think it shocked everybody, our side included. So there's that element. There's the practicalities. Okay, so now what? Now we have to move Gazans from the strip. How do we do that? I have seen Gazans speaking on social media saying, listen, at the first opportunity, I'm out of here. You know, don't judge until you have to live in a tent what living in a tent is like. But then we have that element of Hamas. And Hamas are not going to let anybody out of the Gaza Strip so easily. They need the optics of suffering, and they need the people to control. And there's still the fact that we now have 76 hostages, and judging by what we saw today in ever worsening conditions, that has to be our priority right now, are our hostages, especially given the emaciated, malnourished, horrific visuals that we saw today. So I would be very, very curious. I know Prime Minister Netanyahu says we need to consider this deal very carefully. Don't discount it. It's a very good deal. But I would love it if he would share some of the practicalities, how this deal is broken down, how exactly it is going to be carried out. Trump says no American troops on the ground, but who's going to keep order? Who's going to explode ordnance that's still there, that's unexploded? You know, let's talk implementation.
Yeah.
Well, to pick up on what Rolene said, what you said also about it being a negotiating tactic, there is a school of thought that the real sort of target of President Trump's announcement was towards Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and perhaps Jordan and Egypt. These are during this whole conflict, people have said if there's going to be an ultimate solution to who will actually rule in Gaza and who provide military, the more permanent security presence within Gaza, it would likely be these so-called, if you call them the Sunni Arab states or moderate, everything relative Arab states. But there's been a problem. All of them say that we will not go into Gaza. We will not assume any kind of responsibility or play a role in Gaza unless there is either a decision on a Palestinian state or diplomacy towards a Palestinian state. something which certainly the present Israeli government would not agree to. So there's been this logjam. So there is a school of thought that President Trump's announcement, and like Rolene, I don't know, I'm not even going to venture in his head, so I don't know if this was an intention, that at least it sort of puts pressure on those countries, especially Saudi Arabia, and say, okay, you don't like this idea, what's your idea? And maybe you have to compromise and come into Gaza without it being, for example, a Palestinian state. And by the way, Mike Waltz, the National Security Advisor, he did this explicitly. He said, okay, you don't like this idea, Egypt, Jordan, other Arab states. What is your idea? So that could be the tactic.
So in a sense, what Trump is doing is setting up the Palestinian Arabs in Gaza as best supporting actor and not really caring about what's happening, but actually to try and lure something bigger. He clearly he wants to bring the Saudis into some kind of bigger deal, and how that plays out with Iran. And Rolene, you mentioned, what's in it? What you said it very well. What's I forget the term. What's the pain? What's the return for the pain that we're suffering right now could be with Iran as well. Chris, do you want to come in? I'm just trying to get all your input.
Well, yeah, that's what a lot of people had thought when the hostage deal was agreed to by Witkoff and just a few weeks ago, that somebody was thinking, well, Iran's got to be part of this calculus, even though it wasn't officially, that the U.S. is either going to give Israel the green light to Iran or actually participate in some sort of an attack. Just to go back to some of the people in Gaza, there was a poll we reported on the other day. 44% of young men, even before October 7th, would want to emigrate. 31% of all Gazans would have immigrated. I'm sure those numbers are much more inside Gaza, although I'm not sure how many polls they're doing right now there. But that I think is pretty telling. And like we had talked about, the issues are going to be Hamas. How can Israel, and it almost seems intractable right now, how can Israel get all of the hostages, dead or alive, out? How can they eventually rid Gaza of Hamas? And if those two things are resolved, then I think the whole idea of relocating and rebuilding, I think would be much easier. But those two issues are very difficult. And you mentioned about going into Gaza, and Caleb, you said you were there. We went in several months ago with General Goldfuss, and he was showing us one of the tunnels where some hostages had been held. There were 12 of them, and they knew that 12 had been held in there because back in November, when the first hostage release was there, they identified that particular tunnel and the cage that everybody was filled in it. And I'm just saw on Telegram just a few moments ago as well. They're releasing a picture. Hamas released a picture of Ohad, Eli, and Or in one of those tunnels. I think probably just before they were released. So, but all that to say that it's going to be tough to see what happens as we go forward.
Yeah. So now I'm so engrossed in the conversation, I'm not following 100% who's saying what, but one of you made the comment about Hamas won't want to let people out. Forget that Egypt and Jordan don't want to resettle hundreds of thousands of Gazans for a whole lot of reasons, and that's a whole separate conversation. It's fascinating. It flips the narrative of Gaza being an open air prison before October 7th and since to the other side. People would use that as a narrative to blame Israel for the state of Gaza and that we control. But in fact, if Gazans would be prevented from immigrating by Hamas, that or to other countries by other Arab nations, that flips the idea of who's controlling this alleged open air prison. But I want to go back and dig a little bit deeper. Again, a lot of the tropes that have been out there the last 16 months, genocide, ethnic cleansing, blames of Israel, the the ICC, International Court of Justice, everyone's ganging on. And as I always say, if it's genocide, then we're pretty sucky at doing a genocide. But can this be done? I think it was Waltz or maybe Trump. Somebody came back and said, no, this is actually for their well-being. We got to move them out in order to rebuild. Can this be done without perceptions of genocide or ethnic cleansing? Can people look at it as a possible positive long-term solution?
I repeat what I said before. I'm sorry, Rolene, you go ahead.
One thing I found very interesting today, if you look at the optics of Hamas, usually with the previous hostage releases, they've been very good at considering the optics and making sure that their staging was by heaps of destruction. Today, we didn't see that. They went to where buildings are still standing, as if to say, look at us, we're still standing, we're still inhabitable. None of this Trump nonsense that Gaza is uninhabitable and you need to move people out. And with regards to what you're saying about tropes and accusations of genocide and starvation, there are only 3 people that I saw starving today in the Gaza Strip, and that was Eli, Ohad, and Or. I saw very, very healthy, robust, in fact, slightly overweight looking Hamas terrorists. And I don't know which genocide survivors have women with baskets of glitter and flower petals.
Excellent.
They are able to throw over terrorists. And I find it quite extraordinary that many in the world still don't cotton on that if you've got real shortages, you don't have state-of-the-art cameras and drones, pristine vehicles to transport terrorists, freshly pressed uniforms, and of course, sign writing and staging. I think anybody still buying that malarkey needs to perhaps be referred to a shrink. And after what I saw today, I think that the Red Cross, the United Nations, and all of these NGOs need to be held accountable for what I see as them being complicit in creating not only this narrative, which we know has been brewing for decades now, but complicit in those scenes that we saw today.
Thank you. Kalev, you
Well,
graciously.
I mean, Jonathan, those that seek to besmirch Israel, to incite against Israel, will spin any event or any process as being a genocide or a massacre. I mean, the Palestinians have been saying there's been ongoing genocides, and there's some of their supporters since 1948, during which time the Palestinian population has actually increased, even by their own counting, about 5-fold. So it's only genocide in history where the population actually increased. So I think it's irrelevant to how any of the process can, again, in terms of like relocating the population of Gaza, if the residents of Gaza were told they can go to Europe or North America, yeah, they would leave. But or maybe Saudi Arabia or some other country. Again, the locations that have been suggested, Egypt and Jordan, I don't think would entice them. By the way, many of them could have gone to Egypt over the years, and while there are tens of thousands that have left Gaza in different times, many have settled in Europe. There's actually in South America quite a lot of Palestinian population, many from Gazans in Chile. But a lot of these countries they're closing their doors now to immigration after what we've seen develop in places like Europe. So I don't know that that's carnivoristic. You could see an internal sort of displacement where you have the population. As Rolene said, not every part of Gaza is in ruins. The northern part of the Gaza Strip is very much so, those areas. There are still buildings and areas in the southern part that are less damaged. You could have an internal migration from the north to the south, for example. So again, there are so many practical issues, what to do. To talk about the immigration or migration, we're not even close to that yet. We're not even close to that yet. And as Rolene said, the clock, after seeing the conditions of these 3 hostages now, the clock is kind of ticking on getting those remaining ones out alive. So a process that could take, years to develop is not going to be of use to those hostages that are alive and we know are not great condition. They're being held by in inhumane conditions, being held by Hamas.
And as somebody mentioned in one of the questions leading up to this conversation, and we were talking about the whole biblical analogy at the outset, taking 40 years to cross the desert and actually come into the land. Trump only has a term of 4 years. So, Kalev, the point that you're saying is there really needs to be, in order to see movement, who knows who will be president 4 years from now, but if the U.S. is to be involved in any way, there needs to be, borrowing the Israeli phrase, there need to be facts on the ground soon. Otherwise, it's all theory that can evaporate 4 years from now.
Absolutely. And there have been other ideas floating around. Again, I don't know how realistic any of these are, whether there would be a deal in which some of the leaders Hamas would go into exile into other countries, like Algeria's mentioned, and in return, which would be a bitter pill. After what we saw today, it would be a bitter pill to see those murderers and that did to the hostages what we saw today and worse, get on a boat and go to a place like Algeria. However, Israel does have a long reach over time and has a record of eventually settling scores with those it has to, even if it's could take years to do.
Correct.
Hey, Jonathan, as Rolene said, the clock is ticking on the remaining hostages. And especially because of the condition of Ohad, Eli, and Or. But the other thing is there's a political clock running, and we have we are negotiating about phase 2, but when phase 1 expires, then you have a decision to be made about how does the government continue?
The Israeli government.
The Israeli government, does the war end? And how will that go politically? Will Ben-Gvir continue to be out of the government? Will Smotrich leave the government? Will the government last? So there's several clocks ticking, a political one, a physical one, I would say an emotional one too for Israelis. How much are they going to tolerate this kind of conditions by Hamas, and then complicit with that, the UN and the Red Cross, as Rolene had mentioned. So there's a lot of complicating factors here, and it was a amazing diplomatic feat by Netanyahu, and such a sea change between the Biden administration and the Trump administration. We didn't mention that, but the clock is ticking on a number of fronts.
I'll just interject. I do think President Trump, and again, I'm not reading his mind. I don't know if it was his intention, but he likely bought Prime Minister Netanyahu some time politically by issuing this plan, because Bezalel Smotrich had threatened at the end of phase 1, which is in 3 weeks, to take his party out of the government, which would have collapsed the government unless the war had been resumed. And I do think President Trump bought some time.
Definitely, yes.
Not to digress into Israeli politics too much, but it's also interesting to note that that's the prominent thinking, is that the Netanyahu government could fall if Smotrich pulls out. But what's interesting is a year ago, we had Benny Gantz run into the government with his party to back it up. And everyone's been saying, most of the opposition parties at least, saying that they'll support the government in a deal to have all the hostages released. But I don't see a lot of that now. I don't see a lot of people wanting to step up and say, you know what, Bibi, you do what you have to do to get all the hostages out, and we'll back you even from the opposition. We'll prevent your government. Am I misreading that?
Well, they have said during the course of the deal they would do it. But Prime Minister Netanyahu's concern is that immediately then the day after the last hostage comes out, his government will fall. So there were reports that he had requested from the opposition parties they give him a period of 1 year beyond, in other words, that no matter how it goes, he would at least have 1 more year in office. And that, I think, offer was rejected by the opposition, saying, well, if a hostage deal is done in 3 months, we're not going to give you an additional 8 months.
Sure.
But I do think, just one final thing, that President Trump, in putting this forward, made it clear, because there's a lot of speculation about President Trump's relationship with Prime Minister Netanyahu in his second term. And I think in putting this plan out, President Trump made it clear he wants to work with Benjamin Netanyahu is his preferred partner in the Israeli government to go forward on however this goes. But how that will play out internally in Israel, that's a different story.
Right. A lot of people are asking the question about the relationship between them. And Chris, you just alluded to the difference in relationship between the U.S. and Israel on a macro level under Trump versus Biden. So we're definitely seeing things, and it's not yet clear where it's going to go. I want to put something out there. I wasn't even going to do it. But and Chris, I know you and I have had this conversation extensively, Ronnie, and I don't know if we have, and Kalev, we haven't. But I fell into what I believe actually is the only long-term solution. We're promoting that at Solution for Peace in Gaza.com, and this is not meant to be a promotion for that, although, okay, yes, actually it is, and it should be. Which the notion is that in order to actually see a complete rehabilitation and rebuilding of Gaza, it should be done with 100,000 or 200,000 Christian volunteers from all over the world going in to be responsible for that, to show the love of God, to show a God that is not a God of hate and terror, and to ride on the reality, unfortunate reality, that Gaza is in ruins, and these people have been for a century brainwashed to believe that we, Israel and the Jewish people, have no place here. And we can talk about moving people out. We can talk about physically rebuilding. We can talk about flying a U.S. flag on top of Trump Towers in Gaza City. But none of that addresses the underlying root of the problem, which is Islamic jihadi extremism that's funded by Iran, but comes from long before the Iranian Revolution 46 years ago. Someone asked the question, I printed it, but I don't see it. But the general idea was how do these Trump announcements or proclamations affect my plan? And I'm not going to address that now. I'd like to ask all of you, what's the solution? What is the solution? The U.S. taking it over, moving people out, something else. What's the solution? We're almost 500 days into this massive conflict that still rips all of Israel apart.
Well, I think, first of all, I wouldn't see it as 500 days. I would see it as decades.
Okay.
Because this is a decades-long problem that is set on our border. And one thing is for sure, this cannot continue. And everything that has been tried in the past is clearly not working. And like the Allies did at the end of World War II, with policies of de-radicalization, which were successful in Germany and Japan, this needs to happen in Gaza. It has to be demilitarized. It has to be de-radicalized. We cannot have an UNRWA situation mushroom all over the Gaza Strip again, that's for sure. And we cannot allow for this perpetual cycle of violence. So I would be very, very curious to see if there are any clauses in this proposal that deals with this. You know, it's one thing to say, let's move the people out, let's clear it, and let's rebuild. That's all structural. What happens ideological? That needs to be dealt with. And the second big issue is, how do we deal with the head well, actually, I should say the heads of the octopus, because in my opinion, it's not just Iran, it's Qatar as well, in a very, very well-funded, well-organized anti-Semitic smear campaign everywhere. That has to be dealt with. And I commend President Trump for starting to deal with these issues from a domestic perspective on American soil. Now with his task force for the 7th of October, the threats to deport students who are there on visas, who are Hamas supporters, to conduct investigations into universities like Columbia and like Harvard. But the real problem sits on our border, alongside our citizens. And I want to know what the plan is to de-radicalize and demilitarize.
I guess I certainly second everything Rolene just said about the need for a process of, I would say, denazification, call it what it is, in the Gaza Strip. But again, she raises the issues. Even if you did that, and you changed the education system and got rid of UNRWA, you still have this sort of like culture of incitement throughout the region, coming from Islamic fundamentalism and radicalism. And she mentioned some heads of the snake, and that is a big question about what the Trump administration, for example, Qatar, you mentioned, their main sort of avenue of incitement is Al Jazeera. The Al Jazeera, and the question is how is the U.S. going to deal with Qatar? How is the Trump administration? It hasn't been clear yet. We know Steve Witkoff has had some dealings with Qatar, business dealings, and the questions to be raised is he going to be able to get, and the Trump administration going to get tough on Qatar, by the way, which also hosts the largest U.S. military base in the region.
Right.
And that's something the Trump administration should be looking at. And then, of course, the bigger issue of Iran. And just this week, actually, just in the last couple of days, we saw the Trump administration impose new sanctions and say they're going to go back to this policy of maximum pressure, but seemingly ruling out possible military action, which some people think should not, maybe the Trump administration should have left that more ambiguous.
Military action where?
Against Iran's nuclear.
Okay.
Because Iran, there are the heads of the snake, but the biggest head is Iran.
Right.
And that's the question, is how the Trump administration is going to move forward. Sanctions are fine, that it hasn't been enough in the past. And what kind of actions have to be taken to make sure that whatever arrangement is reached in Gaza is not going to be sabotaged ultimately by Iran or its proxies.
Right. Well, Rolene used the correct term. It's an octopus, and interestingly, octopuses can regrow their tentacles. So even if Gaza were to be completely rebuilt and all the population come out, if Iran and Qatar and others are continuing, let's also give a shout out to the Turks that they're not so friendly either. But I want to point out, and Chris, I want to begin to wrap up with you. The same day that Trump and Netanyahu had their meeting in the press conference, just before that, Trump signed an executive order to reinstill maximum sanctions on Iran. But if you followed his comments, it seemed a little or a lot over the top that he was saying, well, I didn't really want to. I don't know. People convinced me. I'm not so sure if it's a good idea. And I'm not sure if that was him just being off the cuff and wishy-washy, or if that was also another one of his unique negotiating style messages to Iran. But it was unusual, whereas the brashness of all of the executive orders, I haven't seen any one of them so far where he's been ambivalent about, other than the Iranian one. Chris, what you and I had a conversation the other day, among other things, about the quote unquote the solution for peace in Gaza, and not to necessarily promote that, but what's your solution? You've got two esteemed, knowledgeable colleagues who say it's intractable.
Well, it feels intractable, but that's where faith comes in and prayer comes in. And talking about Iran, our mutual friend Marzi, an Iranian believer who converted to Christianity and then was imprisoned. His life was on the line and miraculously escaped. But as she says, there are so many Iranians that are despise the regime and want to see it overthrown. And although President Trump is sending out mixed messages right now, I think he might be giving the process some time, whether that's a few weeks or a few months, to see how Iran reacts to his initial sanctions and executive orders. But I think he might be open to maybe either giving Israel the green light, and it certainly seemed to be giving him the weapons now to go ahead and strike Iran's nuclear facilities. And I'm sure that was a huge part of the conversations with Netanyahu and Trump and all the advisors, including Pete Hegseth and Mike Waltz and the new Israeli ambassador to the U.S. So all of those, I think, were part of the discussion, and some of it behind the scenes. And I think, and we did discuss it, but there's such a sea change between the tailwind that Netanyahu is getting from the Trump administration as opposed to the headwind that the Biden administration had been doing for 4 years, and especially since October 7th. So I think as we see things unfold in the next few weeks or months, I think the Iranian policy, I think, is going to become much clearer.
Cool. Thank you. I want to begin to I'm always going to leave the last words to you to cover things that we didn't cover, but I want to also address some of the questions that people are asking live. One's related to something that we've talked about. Eric is in Colorado, and would it not be practical or possible for the U.S. to send troops to Gaza with the primary purpose of evacuating them? And again, that's presumably on a voluntary basis. I don't think I'll answer that question, Eric. If you're talking about in a non-voluntary way, the U.S. is not going to send troops to evacuate Gazans without. But Kalev, your body language, yes, no.
I mean, first of all, President Trump specifically made a point of saying no U.S. troops in there. There would be great risk for anyone who does it. By the way, 2 Israeli soldiers died this week in the Gaza Strip because a crane that was being used to evacuate some of the installations that Israel has set up fell over in this terrible winter weather we're having and killed them. I mean, I just can't see Americans, President Trump or the American public wanting to see America. As a soldier who served in the Gaza Strip, I can't see the American soldiers being there. If anything, I said perhaps troops from Egypt, from Jordan, Arabic-speaking troops potentially there. I just want to rate this briefly, and maybe this will be my end note about your saying this being intractable. You know, nobody, and I mean literally nobody, predicted that Bashar al-Assad would be pushed out of Syria within a matter of days when it happened. I mean, things in the Middle East can happen. It may seem intractable, but things happen in this region that could be miracles or even for good or bad or one way or another. And as David Ben-Gurion famously said, you know, any Israeli who does not believe in miracles is not a realist. So you know, you just don't know how things are going to break here.
And the great thing about miracles is we can't predict them.
Well, exactly.
So buckle up. Miracles. Rolene, Chris, do either of you think that the U.S. is or could? Eric's clarifying that we're talking about those who leave voluntarily, but even in that capacity, do any of you see the U.S. sending troops?
I don't think it's going to be received very, very well by Americans who don't want American soldiers, from what I understand, involved in conflicts in other parts of the world. I'm really hoping to take this back to what Kalev said earlier. I'm really hoping that this is a negotiating ploy by President Trump to say, okay, Saudi, Emiratis, you guys don't like my plan, but come up with a better plan, because maybe something needs to happen to force the hands of the wealthy maybe more moderate leaning Arab states to do something. They understand just as well as we do the threat posed by Iran. None of those states are very eager to accept the Palestinians. I mean, I do find it very interesting when the King of Jordan waxes lyrical, and I kind of want to remind him, do you remember what your late father did to the Palestinians before you castigate Israel, your Royal Highness, or your Majesty? But you know, I wish I had a crystal ball, but as we've been saying, the great thing about miracles is that they are unpredictable. So I think one thing is for sure, we've got an interesting time ahead, but judging especially from what we've seen today, and I know I keep bringing it back to the visuals of today, I don't think the Israeli public will accept Gaza in this or its 6th of October iteration on our borders. Enough is enough. Something needs to give, and it needs to give soon.
Thank you. Chris, your thoughts?
Well, you know, as you said, the parasha includes one of the greatest miracles of all, the splitting of the Red Sea. So, and I love what you said, Caleb, and quoting Ben Gurion, in order to be a realist, you have to believe in miracles here. And I agree. Who was going to predict that Bashar Assad was going to fall? So things have changed just within recent memory and recent months, and who knows what the future lies, especially with someone as unpredictable as President Trump.
Yeah. Chris, there's a comment specifically to you from Don White's in Dallas. I'm a Jew and I watch the 700 Club every day. Thank you for your excellent coverage and analysis. You are a blessing. I will concur with all of that. Let's maybe the last question before I just open it up to anything that we've missed. Jordan and Egypt also are significant players. Rolene, you just had lovely kind words that we will transmit to the king himself. But there are a lot of questions as to why Jordan and Egypt will refuse to take them. And someone, forgive me, I must have deleted the comment. Someone asked if it was true that in fact most Gazans are originally from Egypt. So Caleb's not shaking his head. No, certainly many of the Palestinians, those who call themselves Palestinians today, are originally, or their descendants, their ancestors from a few generations back were. I don't know that matters as much anymore. But can we just quickly bullet out some of the reasons why Jordan and Egypt are refusing, would refuse, why this would be a problem for
Well,
them?
they have refused, not would refuse. They have
Okay,
refused.
good.
I mean, and Rolene made reference to the Black September, when a time when Jordan did take in Palestinians from the West Bank after the 1967 war, a little bit in 48. And eventually they tried to take over the country from the king there, and the current king's father, and that led to a bloody civil war in Jordan between the Hashemite king Hussein and the Palestinians. They call that Black September, in which he dealt with the Palestinians brutally, more so than Israel has had.
Yeah.
And then that's why he's concerned about the stability of his monarchy. And Egypt, listen, Egypt has been, in my view, a particularly irresponsible player here. They have people forget people say there's an Israeli blockade on the Gaza Strip. There's a border with Egypt. Egypt has had a border. They've kept their border closed, and they've, in terms of letting Gazans out, but haven't been successful in stopping weapons from going into Gaza. And
right.
Egypt has shirked its responsibility over the years. They don't want to let the Palestinians in because they see them as Islamists who would support the Muslim Brotherhood, which is the vowed enemy of the current regime in Egypt of President Sisi. But in terms of, for example, contributing to on the military end to Gaza Strip, to policing the border, to putting their soldiers inside. And remember that until 67, Egypt did control the Gaza Strip. they've had experience there.
And they were offered it back with Camp
100%.
David. Yeah.
So
Good
I
point.
think they've shirked their responsibility. One last thing I want to say, they're also the second biggest recipient of US foreign aid other than Israel, and President Trump freezed all payments of foreign aid except to two countries, to Israel and to Egypt.
Ah, good point.
So Egypt, there is a leverage over Egypt, and I do think his pronouncement was to get Egypt to step up and contribute more positively in some way than they have to this point.
But he needs to be delicate because Egypt doesn't need 5% more of its population who are Islamic Brotherhood inspired jihadis to continue to create problems.
As I said before, no, but Egypt could contribute, certainly, its military forces in the battle against Hamas, because Hamas is part and parcel together ideologically with the Muslim Brotherhood, which is the enemy of the Egyptian government. So Egypt could play, certainly in terms of the military assistance to whatever pacification has to be done in the Gaza Strip, they could play that role.
I love that as a cliffhanger for another conversation. Chris, Rolene, any thoughts on additional thoughts? I mean, Rolene, I think your praise of the Hashemite kingdom is already noted, but any other thoughts on Jordan and Egypt taking or not taking Gazans?
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't Egypt in violation of one of their treaties that does stipulate that should there be a war, that they are duty bound to accept Palestinian refugees? I think the brilliant Natasha Hausdorff has elaborated on that. So they are effectively breaking international law while seeking to lecture Israel on Israel's upholding of international law. But I think we all know the reason that these countries don't want to let Palestinians in. It's because who comes in with the Palestinians, and how much of a threat are they to their governments, their kingdoms? They don't want the Palestinians, but in order to ensure that the street stays mollified, they make these grand sweeping statements.
Yeah.
I don't think any of us will forget anytime soon Queen Rania's statements with regards to the mass rapes committed against Israeli women. As an Israeli woman myself, and one that holds office in a women's organization, a women's Zionist organization, it's very, very hard to find the words to forgive Queen Rania for her comments about the mass raping of Israeli women. So they know the potential threats posed by allowing Palestinians into their countries. They might tell the world that they don't want to see Palestinians displaced, but it's got nothing to do with that and everything to do with self-preservation.
Excellent. Chris, maybe just as a final comment on that, you were just in Egypt, albeit for something different, but what's your, you've been here, as your bio says, I read at the outset, reporting on, a lot of major things, but nothing's minor. I just saw you take out your pen and make a note on Rolene's point, whether they've committed some sort of violation of international treaties by not stepping up. But what's your thought?
Well, I think Rolene and Caleb expressed it quite well. They don't want the threat inside their borders. They don't want people with an ideology that's pretty much the same as the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood spawned Hamas. So for those two reasons, they're a threat. They don't want them in, and then being very disingenuous publicly about speaking out for the Palestinian cause, and yet they don't seem to want to actually do things practically that would help the Palestinians currently. So I think they expressed that quite well. So so I was in Egypt, and it's a very, very poor country as well. They're having a hard time, I think, managing on their own, and 2 million more Palestinians, I don't think is something they would want in their borders. And the reason I was there, just for let people know, in about a week, there's going to be an animated film release called The 21. And we all know, reporting back in 2014-15, when ISIS was on a rampage throughout the region, there were 20 Egyptians and one man from Gaza who infamously were led by ISIS on a beach in Libya and beheaded. And yet they were encouraged to recant their faith in Jesus, but did not. And so they were martyred. And so we went down to, we visited with some of their orphans and met some of the people that are supporting the families and the filmmakers that are making the film called The 21. And it's an excellent film. Was shortlisted by the Oscars, and it's sort of a redemptive, I mean, if it can be a redemptive story in the Middle East, tragic for these men, but a redemptive story in light of their faith in the face of this terror.
Excellent. Thank you, Chris. So I'm doing two things. I'm inviting Rebecca if she wants to come in and join us and close in prayer. But I also want to ask either of you, as I said I would, it's a wide-ranging conversation about Gaza and Trump's comments and Bibi's response and Iran. And Rolene, you've said a couple of times, you probably don't know the American Wendy's commercial, but where's the beef? What's the substance to the plan, to the extent that there already even is a plan? Anything, there's a limited amount, even with three incredible guests like you, that we can cover. But what have we not said? What needs to be put on the table as kind of another cliffhanger or a closing remark? Anyone? Or nothing?
I would say one thing. There was a meeting before Trump and Netanyahu met with 14 evangelical leaders. Governor Mike Huckabee was there, likely the next U.S. ambassador to Israel. I think the current Israeli ambassador to the U.S. was there, and Netanyahu met with 14 leaders. So I think it's an important relationship, the evangelical support of Israel, and I think that's going to continue to be even more important as we go forward.
Yeah,
I just want to end with saying the voices, more than ever, the voices need to be raised throughout the world against the inhumane treatment of the hostages, and that not just among, for example, the Jewish community, but in all communities, civilized communities across the world, including the Christian communities as well. We saw what we saw this morning. The condition of those three men was inhumane, and we need to hear those voices. So a lot is happening in America. I understand people are getting distracted by a lot going on, and also in other parts of the world. But this issue has to be raised and be kept on the international agenda. And prayers, we're going to have prayers. Prayers should be said for those remaining hostages in Gaza.
Yeah. Thank you.
I would just like to thank the evangelical community in the United States for standing so resolutely with us in Israel. Sometimes we feel so alone. And as we have our incredible Iron Dome system, our defense array that fights off the missiles, we have your prayers and your support as our spiritual Iron Dome. And I don't want that to be forgotten. And I also want to thank the United States of America for standing with us, especially this new administration, who have sent the message to the world that they stand with their ally, Israel. But to the rest of the world leaders who just several days ago stood at Auschwitz for the 80th anniversary of its liberation, with their performative grief, making sure that the optics of them looking serious and mourning were captured by the world media. Where are your voices today? We said never again 80 years ago. This morning, and really, I hate to draw comparisons to the Holocaust, but we've heard from our medical experts here that the 3 hostages that were released had the bearings of those who were released from concentration camps, to the point where they have to investigate the feeding protocols of survivors of the Holocaust. That's how severely malnourished they are. To the rest of the world, you said never again. This is your opportunity to raise your voice and join Israel and the United States. Because if you are silent And if you mollify the Hamas supporters in your countries, you are complicit. And I think today sent a message to the world. We are at a make or break moment. And we know where the Trump administration and our American allies stand. Where does the rest of the world stand?
Thank you, Rolene. I would just correct one point. Certainly, we thank our evangelical Christian friends in the US, but here today we have people from Portugal, from South America, from Africa, and we have a lot of support, thank God, from all over the world. And so hopefully those voices will continue. And one of those voices is a good friend, Rebecca Berschwinger, who's just joined us live. You have to unmute yourself. But I asked her to kind of join and spontaneously close out in prayer. Rebecca has her own podcast, One Candle.
Yeah. Yep.
So Rebecca, thank you for joining today. Any comment you want to make and close us out in prayer?
I just want to thank everybody. It's been wonderful listening to this. Jonathan, thank you for hosting this. Took a lot of notes. But I just wanted to say, talking about Americans and the distractions here that are going on. Yes, we have plenty, but I know a lot of people as a Christian and within the Christian community. One of the main reasons, besides securing our borders, that we voted for Donald Trump was because we knew he was a friend to Israel. That was really one of the main voting points for so many people, was that we wanted a leader who was going to be a friend to Israel, a true friend. And we're praying that that's what we got. So.
Would you close us
Yes.
on this topic? Would you do that for us?
Absolutely. Thank you. Heavenly Father, we thank you so very much for this day that you've blessed us with and the ability to come together. You know, here we are, a finite people, calling out to an infinite God. Lord, there's been so many things put out on the table in regard to the apple of your eye, Israel. And as human beings, Lord, we may have lots of thoughts and ideas, but we know you, Lord, are the one who knows. We implore you for your wisdom and your discernment when it comes to Israel. Please help the leaders of especially the United States and Israel, President Trump, Mr. Netanyahu, Lord. Pray that they turn to you for the guidance that they need. Lord, help them to make the right decisions in this case. And Lord, I just ask that there'd be a change of hearts. So much of this it's a land dispute, but a 1,000-year-old ideology and a hatred of the Jewish people. Father, we ask that you would change hearts of all the people that have this demonic hatred of Israel. We don't know what the answer is, God, but we're willing to listen to you, God, and please just guide everyone for a solution. We lift up the hostages that are still over there, Lord. I pray that you will grant them perseverance. You will reveal yourself to them and comfort them with comfort and with peace and with hope. And for the hostages that have returned, Lord, this isn't the end of the story. We know they need a lot of help. We can't imagine the hell that they've been through, but we know they have. And so I ask, Lord, we all ask for healing for them, that they can overcome this, God, and live healthy and productive lives. We pray for healing for them and peace and comfort as well. All those who have lost family members. And of course, we always pray for the peace of Jerusalem. Thank you again, Father, for who you are. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Amen.
Thank you, Kalev and Rolene and Chris. I knew it would be a great conversation. You did not under-deliver. Thank you for that. Thank you for taking time on a busy Saturday night here in Israel. As we always wrap up our conversations, from almost the very beginning of Inspiration from Zion, we've had a great project. I always look at my bookshelf. We call it From Jonathan's Bookshelf, and every month we offer a free gift, a book, a special book, as a result of just trying to thank you for following us. So in order to receive the book that we've been promoting now for the last, I would say 17 months, 18 months, has been our book, Israel the Miracle, 75 essays by Christian leaders from all over the world writing about why Israel is so significant. I'm honored that Chris Mitchell has one of those really important essays in that book. And all you need to do to get your copy for free is like, comment, or share the link to this. And every month we pick somebody at random who's done that. We're always grateful that this conversation is sponsored by our friends at the Willow Run Greenhouse in Culpeper, Virginia. I don't know if anyone's ever done it, but if you're in the area, pop in and thank them for helping make conversations like this possible. And special thanks to the Coin family as well for their meaningful sponsorship. Inspiration from Zion and all the Genesis 123 Foundation programs are made possible by donations. So please consider joining us to help continue the dialogue and build bridges. And if you'd like to sponsor a future episode in honor or memory of a loved one or special occasion, or your favorite Hashemite king and queen, please be in touch at Inspiration from Zion at gmail.com. We love to hear your comment as part of a dialogue and invite you to send any questions as well, especially questions about traditional Judaism for our Ask the Rabbi programs. Please share this with others who will also find it of interest, and continue to join us right here where we bring you more meaningful conversations about topics in Israel that you won't hear anywhere else. Wherever you are in the world, I pray that you and your loved ones are all safe and healthy, and I send my blessings from right here in the Judean mountains. God bless you.